I watched my cousin's face go completely still the moment she realized what she was holding in her hands. Not angry, not sad, just blank. The kind of blank that comes right before everything falls apart. And standing there in the middle of that crowded restaurant, surrounded by 200 of her closest friends and colleagues, I finally understood what my grandmother had been preparing me for all along. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this actually started. I grew up in a house where the rules were simple. My cousin Lauren was the star, and I was the supporting cast. Lauren was 3 years older than me, effortlessly beautiful in the way that made adults stop mid-sentence to compliment her. She had my aunt's cheekbones and my uncle's confidence, and she wore both like armor. I had my mother's stubbornness, and my father's tendency to go quiet when I was hurting, which, in our family, was basically a social disability. Our mothers were sisters, close enough that we spent every holiday together, every summer weekend at my grandparents' lake house in upstate New York, every school break crammed into the same minivan driving somewhere that was supposed to be memorable. Lauren and I were raised practically as sisters. That was the word everyone used. Practically sisters. I used to think that phrase was sweet. Now I understand it was a warning. The dynamic between us was never cruel, not exactly. Lauren didn't bully me. She just occupied so much space that there was very little left for me. When we were teenagers, and I joined the school newspaper, Lauren decided to join too, and within 2 months she was editor. When I got a part-time job at a local bakery at 16, Lauren started talking about how she'd always wanted to learn to bake, and my aunt signed her up for a professional pastry class across town like it was nothing. When I started dating my first serious boyfriend at 19, Lauren spent one Thanksgiving weekend being her most charming self, and by Christmas he was texting her instead of me. That last one I forgave. I told myself I was being paranoid. He and I weren't that serious anyway. And Lauren seemed genuinely surprised that I was upset, tilting her head with that look she had, the soft, puzzled look that made you feel like the problem was your perception, not her behavior. My grandmother saw it differently. My mother's mother, who I'll call Gran, was the kind of woman who built things. She had started a small event planning business in the 1980s, when no one took her seriously. And by the time I was born, it had become one of the most respected hospitality consulting firms in the Northeast. She had clients up and down the East Coast, a reputation that took 30 years to build, and hands that were always slightly calloused from a lifetime of refusing to let other people do her work for her. Gran loved Lauren. I want to be clear about that. But she watched our dynamic with the quiet, careful attention of someone who has seen a particular kind of story play out before and knows how it ends. When I was 22, fresh out of college with a communications degree and absolutely no idea what to do with it, Gran offered me a job. Not a courtesy position, not answering phones. She sat me down at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a yellow legal pad and said, "I want you to learn this business from the ground up. Every department, every relationship, every mistake I've ever made that I had to fix quietly before anyone noticed." She looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "You have something Lauren doesn't. You pay attention to the room instead of performing for it. In this industry, that is worth more than you know." I worked for Gran for 3 years. I started in vendor coordination, moved to client relations, spent 8 months doing logistics for large-scale corporate events, and ended up running the communications and partnerships division by the time I was 25. It wasn't glamorous. It was spreadsheets and phone calls, and learning how to read a contract and understanding which vendors would quietly overcharge you if you let them. But I loved it. For the first time in my life, I was genuinely good at something that Lauren had never touched. That changed the spring I turned 26. Lauren had spent her 20s bouncing between marketing jobs in New York City, each one more impressive sounding than the last, each one lasting about 18 months before she moved on. She was good at first impressions. Great at them, actually. She could walk into a room and make everyone feel like she was exactly the person they'd been looking for. The problem, as I eventually understood, was the follow-through. Lauren was built for launches, not maintenance. When she moved back home to Connecticut after her most recent position ended mutual decision to part ways, she said. With that same puzzled tilt of the head, my aunt immediately suggested she come work with Gran. The family business, my aunt said, as though it had always been Lauren's as much as mine. Gran said she'd think about it. What Gran actually did was call me. She told me she was going to bring Lauren on in a business development role, client-facing, externally focused, which was where Lauren genuinely shone. She told me she was also, quietly, in the process of updating her estate planning. She said she wanted me to know that the business would be protected. She didn't elaborate. I didn't push. With Gran, you learned to trust that she had already thought further ahead than you had. Lauren joined the company in April. By June, she had charmed half our client roster and taken credit for a partnership I had spent 4 months negotiating. Not maliciously, at least not in any way I could prove. She mentioned it in a meeting as something we had been working on, with a smile so warm and inclusive that calling her out would have made me look paranoid. I recognized the move. I had been watching it my whole life. I said nothing. I went back to my desk and I kept working. What I didn't know was that Lauren had also started spending a lot of time with my boyfriend. His name was Daniel. We'd been together for 2 years. He was an architect, quiet and methodical, in the way that balanced out my tendency to move fast and second-guess myself later. We had an apartment together in Hartford. We had a dog, a terrier mix named Fig, whom we had adopted together from a rescue shelter on a rainy Sunday when we couldn't think of anything better to do. We had a whole life that felt like mine, in a way that very few things ever had. Lauren came to our apartment for dinner twice. She was perfect both times, complimenting the food I'd cooked, laughing at Daniel's dry humor, helping clear the table without being asked. The second time, she and Daniel ended up talking for an hour after I went to bed early with a headache, and I lay in the dark telling myself that I was being unfair to her, that I was so conditioned to expect betrayal from her, that I was manufacturing it. I found out 3 months later, not through a dramatic confrontation or an accidentally seen text. I found out because a mutual friend, uncomfortable with holding the information any longer, sat across from me at a coffee shop and told me quietly that Lauren and Daniel had been seen together, more than once, in ways that were not ambiguous. I drove home. I sat in the parking lot of our apartment building for 40 minutes. Then I went upstairs, and I had the most controlled, devastating conversation of my life. And Daniel confirmed everything, and I asked him to be out of the apartment within the week. I did not call Lauren. I did not call my aunt. I called Gran. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Come for dinner on Sunday. Just you and me." I spent that week moving mechanically through my days. I went to work. I sat in the same meetings as Lauren and watched her be radiant and attentive and completely unbothered. Either she didn't know that I knew, or she had decided that my feelings on the matter were not her primary concern. Both possibilities said everything. Sunday dinner with Gran lasted 4 hours. She fed me pot roast and asked me careful questions. And at the end of the evening she said something I have thought about nearly every day since. She said, "The mistake people make is thinking that revenge is about making someone else feel pain. It isn't. It's about reclaiming the ground they took from you. You don't need to destroy Lauren. You need to make sure that what is yours stays yours." She paused, and then she said, "I've already started." I didn't fully understand what she meant until 8 months later. Lauren and Daniel became official with the speed of people who have nothing left to hide. Within weeks of my moving out, they were posting photos. Within 2 months, they were attending family gatherings as a couple, which meant I either attended or ceded that ground too. I attended. I wore good clothes, and I smiled, and I talked to my relatives about things that had nothing to do with either of them. And I watched my aunt beam at her daughter like Lauren had accomplished something. Gran watched all of it too. 7 months after everything fell apart, Gran was diagnosed with a cardiac condition that required surgery. The surgery went well, but her recovery was slow, and during that period she began the process of formalizing everything she had been quietly building. She brought in her attorney. She updated every document. She was meticulous and unsentimental about it, the way she was meticulous about everything. She also called me into her home office one afternoon while she was still recovering and handed me a folder. Inside was a document transferring a significant block of her company's ownership shares to me, effective immediately, not upon her death, immediately. 38% of the business, added to the 12% she had given me 2 years prior as part of my compensation structure. 50% total. A controlling interest, held jointly with the board she trusted, structured in a way that her attorney had spent considerable time making airtight. She also showed me a secondary document, a clause in her updated will, specifying that any family member employed by the firm who was found to have engaged in conduct that created a hostile work environment, or who was found to have materially damaged the company's internal relationships or reputation, would be excluded from any inheritance tied to the business. Gran was precise about language. She had always been precise. She looked at me and said, "I'm not doing this for revenge. I'm doing this because this company deserves to be led by someone who will protect it. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't find the timing satisfying." Gran passed away 5 months later. It was expected and still terrible, the way those things always are. Lauren cried beautifully at the funeral. My aunt held her hand. Daniel stood at the back and had the decency to look uncomfortable. 2 weeks after the funeral, Gran's attorney read the will. Lauren received a generous personal bequest. Gran was not cruel. But the business, the thing my aunt had been mentally earmarking for Lauren's eventual security for years, the asset that my aunt had casually described to relatives as the family company that transferred to me, majority ownership, board authority, the name Gran had built over 30 years. My aunt's expression, when she understood what she was hearing, was something I will carry with me for a long time. Lauren asked to meet with me privately. I agreed, because I am my grandmother's granddaughter, and I have learned how to sit across from difficult situations without flinching. She was composed, which I respected. She said she felt the distribution was unequal, given how much she had contributed. I said I understood that was how it felt. She said she thought Gran had perhaps made decisions, while she wasn't entirely well. I said Gran had been more entirely well in the last year of her life than most people were in their best decade. Lauren left without the outcome she was looking for. Here is the part where I tell you about the restaurant. 6 weeks after the will reading, Lauren and Daniel got engaged. It was fast. My aunt called it romantic. My mother called me to warn me before I saw it online, and they planned an engagement celebration for the following month. A private dining room at a restaurant in downtown Hartford. 200 guests, the kind of event that announces itself. I received an invitation from my aunt, who I believe genuinely thought I would not come, and who I believe genuinely thought, if I did come, that my presence would make me appear generous, and them appear gracious. I came. I wore a dress the color of champagne, not white. I want to be clear. I am not interested in symbolism that overshadows the actual point. I had my hair up. I arrived on time. I said hello to relatives I hadn't seen since the funeral, and I ate the past appetizers and I waited. What Lauren and Daniel did not know was that, the previous week, I had finalized a decision I had been building toward for 2 months. A former client of Gran's, a large hospitality group based in Boston, had been interested in a partnership with the firm. The deal would significantly expand our footprint and bring in 3 new senior team members, all of whom, per the restructuring plan, would effectively make Lauren's business development role redundant. The partnership was good for the company. I had done the due diligence. I had also, I will admit, appreciated the timing. I had asked Gran's attorney to arrange for the formal partnership documents to be messengered to the office that afternoon, with a cover letter I had written that outlined the new organizational structure, including the positions that were being eliminated. Lauren received her copy by text from our office manager, about 40 minutes into her own engagement party. I watched her read it across the room. I watched her face go through several things in quick succession: confusion, understanding, a flash of something sharp, and then settle into that carefully composed blankness. She walked toward me through the crowd. People moved slightly out of her way. the way they always did for Lauren, because she moved through rooms like she expected them to rearrange themselves for her, and they usually did. She stopped in front of me and she said, quietly, so no one around us could quite hear, "Was this necessary?" I said, "The partnership is good for the company." She said, "You know what I mean." I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, "Gran built something real. I'm going to protect it." That was always her first priority, and it's mine. Lauren looked at me for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "I did love him, you know. It wasn't just." I said, "I know." That actually made it worse. She nodded once, like she was absorbing something, and then she went back to her fiancé, and I finished my glass of water and said my goodbyes, and drove home in the dark with the windows down. Fig was waiting for me at the door. I sat on the floor with him for a while, and didn't think about anything in particular. The months that followed were not triumphant in the way that stories like this are sometimes supposed to end. Lauren and Daniel married in the spring. I wasn't invited, which was fine. The firm completed the partnership deal and grew significantly. I hired 2 people who were excellent and worked hard and didn't know anything about my family history. My aunt and I have a relationship now that is polite and slightly formal, like 2 people who have read the same book and disagreed about the ending. I think about Gran a lot. I think about that Sunday dinner and what she said about reclaiming ground. I think about the fact that she spent months, while she was sick, making sure that the thing she had built would not be absorbed by the gravity of someone else's wanting. She used to say that the most powerful thing a woman can do is be so undeniably competent that there is no story anyone can tell about her that makes her look small. She meant it professionally, but I have found it applies in most situations. I am 31 years old. I run a company that my grandmother built with her own hands. I have a dog who treats every morning like the best morning that has ever happened. I have a job that asks me to pay attention to rooms, and I am very good at it. A few weeks ago, I received an email from Lauren. Not hostile, not apologetic exactly, but something in between, the kind of message that is reaching towards something without being sure if the other person will reach back. She said she'd been thinking. She said she hoped I was well. She said she missed Gran too. I haven't responded yet. I'm still deciding what I want the next part of this to look like. What I know is this. The women who raised us were sisters, and they loved each other imperfectly and completely, the way families do. Lauren and I are not the same story, but I am no longer afraid of how our story ends. I know what's mine. I know how to hold it, and when the time is right, I'll know what to say.